Hello, fellow travellers. This is Simon McKerrell, live from the spare bedroom, coming to you to talk to you about music in the rural creative economy. I'm really grateful to Menelaos, to Richard, to V, to Mel, to everybody who's maybe going to be part of this rural cluster. Um, I just think it's a great idea. I would love to talk more and exchange ideas with people across the uni about rural stuff. I promise I'm going to keep this short. I'm really going to try hard. So I'm going to race through where I'm at, why I'm there, and what I'm going to be doing, in the hope that some of this might echo with other people. Um, so at the moment, I am at the start of a new project, music in the rural creative economy. And the whole primary goal of this project is it's an HRC fellowship to investigate how best to support musical micro enterprises in the rural creative economy. This, for me, comes from a place where, um, well, without going into too much detail, most of the creative economy research I've read over the last decade at least just doesn't touch a lot of the people that are my friends. And I'm talking about mostly musicians, of whom I used to be, and they don't earn a lot of money. In fact, many of them actually, you know, if they return a VAT summary or if they turn a tax return, it's a loss every year. But they might make three or four or £5,000. Sometimes they make more than that. Some professional musicians obviously make a lot more than that. But it's not just about musicians, it's also instrument makers, venue owners, administrators, music teachers, festival organizers. All these people, just to me, appear to be absent from so much of the cultural policy research, musicological research, and to the best of my knowledge, rural research, although not entirely, obviously. So the primary goal of this fellowship is to look at how best to support these people on small and partial incomes living in rural areas in the Highlands and the islands of Scotland, who just don't seem to appear in the literature. And most professional music making is done by those people. It's not done by large companies who are VAT registered for 85 grand. It's done by individual small people, sole traders, self-employed. So, um, in 2018, I was working in Argyll, and in Argyll, I was doing a fieldwork project on traditional music in Argyll and Bute, west coast of Scotland. Very rural, extremely spread out region, no obvious centre. It includes Oban, Campbelltown, Kintyre, all the way to Dunoon. It also includes, bizarrely, Helensburgh, um, and so it's a really quite an unusual region in Scotland. It's very sparsely populated. It's got a declining population, 48,000 working age at the moment, and going down. I think somewhere in the region of 88 or 89,000 all in population. So it's tiny. Um, and we interviewed Jasmine Hornibrook, who is a postdoc fellow at Newcastle in 2018, and a brilliant ethnomusicologist like myself. She's worked on diaspora, Sri Lankan and Tamil musicians in London, the diaspora there. So she came to Newcastle, um, and she came on a Northern Bridge postdoc, which was great in 2018. We interviewed about 50 people across Argyll. Many of the issues that came up are essentially the same issues. And what I mean by that is the same issues in rural areas that have been coming up in a lot of the rural literature that I've read. A lot of the people in music interviews were talking about broadband. Broadband as a key problem of connectivity. They were talking about distance traveled, isolation. They were talking about depopulation, having to move. They were talking about, total lack of support in terms of policy at the regional level. They were talking about the higher costs that they have to incur if they do want to work in, the islands or the remote areas of Scotland, the Highlands and Islands. Talking about housing, things like that. And this combined with a lot of the work that I've read recently in cultural policy study and some of my frankly unease with just the urban nature of a lot of the literature and the kind of national focus, the focus on national economies and national data sets led me into this research. So, we had some brilliant examples, which I won't bore you with at this point in time, but examples like, fencing costs, two festivals 15 miles apart, both paying over £5,000 each to hire fencing for their individual festivals. Massive fixed cost because, and it being brought up all the way from northern England to rural Argyll. Insurance, policing costs, touring costs for musicians, venue costs, all sorts of issues coming up that just I could not see in the literature. Also, total absence of local authority funding, decimated arts provision across all 32 council areas has been absolutely decimated. A huge story nobody is talking about. Media haven't really dealt with the SKIOs and the transfer of assets in the arts and local authorities from the public sector into um, Scottish charitable incorporated organisations. So I've done some work in that as well, and it's a scary picture for me anyway. So all of this builds up with some of the more scholarly things that had been coming to light in my own work and other people's work. So for instance, Anna Morecambe was a colleague and ethnomusicologist at UCLA, has really been at the forefront of trying to encourage musicologists to think much more about the financial and economic aspects of music making to try and get us to move on a wee bit and think about where we're going in the discipline. Moving on, my thought was if this is Argyll, then what's happening in the rest of the Highlands and Islands? And it's not homogeneous picture. Skye, for instance, is well documented having a huge tourist boom. Um, so there's this terrible kind of metropolitan, or George Simmel would call like a metropolitan outlook in cultural policy studies, and this focus on the national. There's some really good research that had been happening by uh, Schlesinger, Self, and Monroe, recently talking about the invisibility and about the majority of creative economy activity taking places in micro enterprises, people less than 10 people effectively, but a lot of them are just sole traders. So almost all of that means that a lot of the activity that goes on, the social capital and the activity in our rural areas is completely invisible statistically. It doesn't get returned. It doesn't show up in government released data sets. And also, there are very few even ethnographic accounts of how enterprise and social capital in the arts are configured. Well, certainly there are some, but there's some in good ones from Tasmania, from New Zealand. I've read some good stuff from North America as well and the UK, but generally that literature is absent, I would say. There's a big gap there to me. And also there's this thing about music being an object as well. Most accounts of music and social capital and cultural capital and these things tend to think of music as an object, as a commodity. That's changed a bit, but I much more work with music as a sort of relational thing that people engage in as an activity, a thing that they do. So anyway, so that's all kind of been driving my interest in this area. And not least of all, also combined with the sheer fact that my friends uh, in music, as musicians, as instrument makers, they're just not there in in a lot of the government statistics, and they're not there in terms of policy. Regional policy caters to large companies or SMEs. They just don't exist. Tax regulations are notoriously difficult for them, inflexible. So I'm interested in what kind of policy interventions might actually help them at the regional level. And most of this is going to be done in a kind of capital exchange, goods, Borgesian approach. Because, I believe, like some others, particularly sociologists of music and ethnomusicologists, that music doesn't create community, that people create communities. Um, and so that's kind of just a kind of pithy way of saying that really I'm much more interested in the relational approach, um, rather than a kind of music as object or as an art as object approach, if you like. So anyway, I suppose I should really wrap up. I've been taking some inspiration from some of the social capital research. But a lot of that seems to conceive of music as a sort of commodity, as a form of exchange, or as a proxy even for other kind of things like cultural capital, or you know, some really good work done on socioeconomic class relations, where music is Mike Savage and those other people have done some really interesting work about omnivorousness and taste and stuff. But it doesn't, to me, really get at the key of how music actually constructs communitas and social capital, particularly in rural areas. It takes music as a kind of a form of commodity or as a proxy. So that's what I want to do. I want to do, you know, interviews, in-depth ethnographic interviews to figure out what the kind of how the exchange takes place between these different forms of capital, and how regional policy might be shaped to actually improve that, across the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, but also elsewhere, hopefully. Um, and I've got these research questions. What's the most effective way to support musical micro enterprises in the rural creative economy? What do these small and partial incomes have? What value do they have? How is capital converted between symbolic, economic, and social capital through musical participation? And what contribution do these musical micro enterprises make to their local communities? So those are the research questions, etc., etc. Oh, I'm well over time. I tried my best. I'm really sorry I ran over. It's been a long-standing interest of mine, is where, ethnography meets generalizability. So there'll be a big survey data, there'll be lots of interviews. I'd love to hear more about your work. You know, I'd love for us to be in touch. And I think this whole idea of a research cluster on rural, across the whole university is just great. So I'm totally up for it. And I look forward to meeting in person for a drink soon. And I hope everybody's doing okay. All the best.